My name is Gail Anderson. I am the Director of Interfaith and Intercultural Initiatives at United Seminary. I've been here for about a year and a half doing that kind of work to prepare our students to be leaders in a multi-faith world. So this is thematic. This whole conference is thematic for my work. Before we start with our afternoon, I want to do a very needed thanks, and that's to Kylie Todd-Raska right over here. Yeah, she's done this all, and we hope she stays standing for the next 3 hours or so until it's done. I am very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. Dr. Shanta Premawardhana is been doing this work in interfaith for a very long time, far before it was a trendy kind of buzzword thing to do. Currently, he is the president of SCUPE, which is the Seminary Consortium for Urban Pastoral Education out of Chicago. It's a consortium, it's a curriculum for seminaries to teach students about context, about the urban context, about the interfaith context, and they do really wonderful work, and they have a program, a class starting in June. Paul Knitter is one of the, so if you want to go down to Chicago, I certainly do, and get a class from Paul Knitter and Shanta on interfaith, that would be great. Shanta is originally from Sri Lanka, and he completed his seminary education in Sri Lanka and India. He came to the United States in '81 for graduate study at Northwestern, and for 14 years he was senior pastor of Ellis Avenue Church, which is on the south side of Chicago. He, prior to being at SCUPE, was the director of interreligious dialogue and cooperation at the World Council of Churches based in Geneva, and that whole time he never summoned me to Geneva. I kept waiting. Gail, I need you here to help, but never. And before that, he was the Associate General Secretary for Interfaith Relations at the National Council of Churches of Christ, or the NCC, based in New York. So his work includes helping the global church bodies articulate a comprehensive theological basis for interreligious dialogue and cooperation relative to our contemporary context. He spearheaded a joint initiative between the Vatican, the World Evangelical Alliance, and the World Council of Churches, seeking agreement on a code of conduct for Christian witness. And that document is available on the internet if you want to find it, is how we be Christian witness in a pluralistic world with, written by the Vatican and the World Evangelical Alliance and the World Council of Churches. He's worked on the project accompanying churches in situations of conflict, which encourages churches to stand in solidarity with other churches facing religious persecution. And his primary task was to bring religious leaders from such contexts to dialogue tables to seek together ways of resolving conflicts and finding means of reconciliation. He's on the governing board of the National Council of Churches and on the board of trustees of the Parliament of World Religions. I don't think we could have found somebody more knowledgeable about this topic to come speak to us. He was named Parish Pastor of the Year in 1998, and the Islamic Society in North America awarded him an Interfaith Unity Award in 2007, which is where I met Shanta at the ISNA convention in Chicago, where he busted me in somehow to the lunch that was like $150 a plate or something, so I thank him for that. So let's have a warm welcome for Shanta Premawardhana.
Thank you, Gail. Good afternoon, everybody. It is lovely to be here in this very beautiful chapel. It was a nice lunch, wasn't it? I hope you all can stay awake. I'm grateful for that introduction, and I sincerely appreciate the robust work of interfaith relations that has taken place in this city over a long time under Gail's leadership in the Minnesota Council of Churches, and now here in this seminary. And so it has been a very good time for me to connect with what is going on here in the Twin Cities. I also have worked with another colleague who is not in this room at this moment, but will be here, Steve Newcomb. Steve and I participate in an organization called the Interfaith Organizing Initiative, which brings together the organizing networks of different organizing networks to one table. And these people traditionally fight with each other. So it is quite a task to keep them at the table. Right now, Steve is on a phone call with them. But Steve and I have put together events at the American Academy of Religion, trying to see how we can get the methods and the content of community organizing into seminary curricula. That has been the kind of thing that we have been doing, and I'm very grateful that United Seminary is in the forefront of that kind of activity. Indeed, the emphasis on social justice as a curriculum is a very, very important thing at a time when social justice has become a contested item. Some years ago, this was an imperative of the Christian faith, and suddenly it has become a contested item. My remarks today come from these many years of experience helping the ecumenical movement engage in the interreligious world as well as in the work of theological education. SCUPE, as you heard, is an organization of 12 seminaries. They are all the way from St. Paul, Minnesota, to Louisville and to Pittsburgh and to Richmond, Virginia. They are in a variety of ecumenical confessional traditions. And we specialize now for 40 years in what you call urban contextual theology. You all know about Paul of Freire, who wrote the classic Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Well, this guy is our patron saint. We want to do what he began, or he wanted us to do, in engaging the people in the margins for their own liberation, for our mutual liberation. And so when students come to us, we put them right back into the streets so that they can listen to the struggles and the pain that is going on in the margins, and it is out of that we begin a conversation around theology. You can't, in contextual theology, you don't begin by going to the library. Don't get me wrong, I've lived in libraries, but that's not where theology begins for us. It begins at the street. And with that conversation, we then go to understand what the scripture and tradition have to say about those kinds of questions. And so new questions arise. We want to ask at a time, you all know when the Pew study came last week about religion. America is becoming less religious, it said. The number of nuns are growing, N-O-N-E nuns, the people who don't claim a religious tradition, and the number of duns, D-O-N-E duns, people who are done with church. For no reason, for no conflict or anything like that, one day they wake up in the morning and say, I am done. And partly because the church often ceases to be relevant to this multi-faith and complex world. Our title today, Public Theologian in Engaging the Multi-Faith World, therefore fits me rather well. I'm grateful for that. For all these years, SCUPE has been committed to public theology. Back in the early 1990s, when I was a pastor in Chicago, I would go to SCUPE congresses. Congresses on urban ministry happened every other year. And you all know, many of you, I'm sure, who have a UCC background, know Yvonne Delk, Dr. Yvonne Delk, African-American, powerful, one of the more powerful preachers you ever can hear. She was speaking, and she hammered this into my head as a young pastor those days. She said, if you're a pastor, you're not a pastor to your congregation. You're a pastor to your community. Your church pays you to be a pastor to your community. Problem is, they don't know that yet. You have to teach them that. a public theologian, pastor, is a powerful leader. She recognizes her privilege but identifies with the margins and views social and political and economic institutions from that perspective. She understands that the church has fallen prey to those values, and she is willing to challenge and use the church for the sake of the gospel. When she preaches, teaches, speaks, writes, her voice is a public voice, meaning that she is courageous in speaking truth to power, skilled in engaging in public dialogue and debate with public officials and business and civic leaders about how institutions can come into compliance with the values and the ethics of the gospel. She is trained in the methods of organizing people and organizing money in order to build a powerful base out of which she can challenge institutions and create change. One such leader I know is Reverend Osagyefo Uhuru Seku. Do you all know that name? Reverend Seku is an African-American Baptist minister. He was born in Ferguson, Missouri. And having being pastor of a church, First Baptist Church of Jamaica Plains in Boston, on August of last year, he left that and came back to Ferguson. And he began organizing in Ferguson. He began leading the protests in Ferguson. He began to say to these young people, here's how you engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. So we brought him to one of our classes this January, and had him speak to our class. And he spoke about the theological implications of what is going on in Ferguson in the morning. Then in the afternoon, he gave the students a demonstration in nonviolent civil disobedience. He gave them a training. This was just physical training. These students had never experienced something before. How do you fall when police beat you? How do you protect another when police beat you? How do you videotape in a way that is appropriate? All of these kinds of questions that we don't typically understand until we get into the real context, he gave these people, these students, this training. And then he said these words. He said, in the public lecture that he gave in the evening, he said, these young people, over and over again, he said, these young people, motivated by a deep, abiding love, he said, these young people, these queer, young, black women, they are the ones who are leading us towards justice. They are the ones that God is speaking through today. And he said, the church is not listening. Church is not listening. And so he said to us, it's 50 years since Martin Luther King. It is 50 years since Voting Rights Act. It is 50 years since Bloody Sunday in Selma. But it is as if nothing has changed. It is open season on black men and women. So he asks, what is wrong with our theology that 50 years later we are still fighting the same battle? Think about that question for a minute. What is wrong with our theology that we are doing that? This is where contextual theology begins for us. 40 years now, where SCUPE has focused on the method of urban contextual theology. And if we affirm that in the streets of Ferguson and Baltimore, and indeed here in the Twin Cities, God is still speaking, then theology must begin here. But this is not as easy as it sounds, because we are conditioned to think that this is not where theology begins. It is received theology that we understand. When I went to seminary back in the 1970s in Sri Lanka, they said to me, theology is 3 B's: Barth, Brunner, and Bultmann. But there's a little Schleiermacher thrown in there, a little Wesley and Luther and Augustine thrown in there. Mind you, 1970, in a country which is largely Buddhist and Hindu, coming out of 450 years of colonialism, with an ethnic war about to erupt, the three B's didn't make a darn bit of sense. And so we had to ask, what is contextual theology in this place? Those were the received theologies that what our accrediting body, Senate of Serempo College, said, you need to sort of put in a bottle and put in a pill and swallow. Now you're a theologian. In that class, when Reverend Seku spoke, there was a German church executive, Reverend Martina Severin Kaiser, Lutheran, from the Lutheran Church in Hamburg, Germany. And she reminded us that a terrible thing happened in Germany 75 years ago. The extermination of 6.5 million Jews. And she reminded us that it was baptized Christians who did that killing. And that meant that we had to ask some very hard questions about our theology. Because it is not in spite of our theology that they killed, but because of our theology. And so we had to ask, what does that mean for us? And she said, German theology really has not been the same since. So that reminded me of an incident, which I related to them. This was time when I was at the World Council of Churches. The King of Saudi Arabia, the one who died a few months ago, he called an interreligious gathering of religious leaders in Madrid. The problem when you invite religious leaders is that 250 of them, they end up being old men. So this gathering had just about 10% of the people were women or people under 30. And there was a protest from the audience about this. And they, to their credit, very quickly went and got a young woman, professor of philosophy at the Madrid University, to come and speak. So the next day she spoke. And she said this, I know because I wrote it down. It was so good. She said, Christian theology has not been the same since the Holocaust. Muslim theology has not been the same since 9/11. But both these atrocities were perpetrated by men. Why is male-dominated theology still the same? Think about that. So at the end of the day, we're talking about theology. We are talking about what is wrong with our theology, that 50 years after the civil rights movement, we are still struggling with blatant and brutal racism. That's a good question to ask. In fact, a public theologian who has her ear to the ground must ask some really hard questions of received theologies. Here's another one. What's wrong with our theology that in the Twin Cities, as it is in Chicago, there are some areas of concentrated poverty, and there are other areas of concentrated wealth? One of my favorite authors who addressed this question is not a theologian. He's a professor of law at the University of Minnesota, former state senator from the great state of Minnesota, Myron Orfield. I don't know if you know that name. Myron Orfield wrote 2 books, Metropolitics and American Metropolitics, where he breaks down the infrastructure of how tax base works, how economic policies work to keep people poor in poor communities and keep people wealthy in wealthy communities. So what's the answer? People in the inner core of the city must build alliances with the inner core of the suburbs, so that you don't have to deal with the outer core of the suburbs, right? So these are kinds of things. You needed a political scientist to say that to us. What's wrong with our theology that we didn't come up with that? That's the question I want to ask. My former colleague at the World Council of Churches, Wesley Ariyaraja, wrote a very important book that I hope you all will read. It is on this question of how received theologies, how we must deal with received theologies in the context of the plurality of religions. The book is called Your God, My God, Our God. Your God, My God, Our God. It's a small book. but it's a very important book where he breaks it down about how we need to come to a place like in Acts 15, you had the first Jerusalem Council to think about how does Christianity distinguish itself from Judaism at the time. Today we need another Jerusalem Council, he says, to deal with the real hard questions that come to us from the world of religion. So, back to this question about economic disparity, because this is a question of public theology, and I want to say a few words about that, because SCUPE has this Congress on Urban Ministry every couple of years, and this last time, we dealt with this question of wealth disparities and the consequences of wealth disparity for our theology. Did you know that the world's richest 67 people control the same amount of wealth as half the world? Here's another way to think about it. The wealth of 67 have access to the same resources. Each of those 67 people have access to the same resources as do about 42 million people. Those are incredible numbers. But the real problem is this. In the world and in the US particularly, there's a rise of plutocracy that is happening right under our eyes that is going to take from the free representative democracy that we have enjoyed for a very long time. And here we are maybe reaching a tipping point where laws such as Citizens United and dismantling of the Voting Rights Act are both driven by big corporate interests that will tilt the playing field in favor of the super rich in time to come. So we invited Alan Buzak to our Congress. You all know Alan Buzak, the Reformed theologian from South Africa. Here's why we did that. Alan Buzak's primary contribution to theology happened in 1982 when he was the one who spearheaded the movement that declared apartheid a heresy. You remember, apartheid was church-sanctioned doctrine. South African Reformed Church had it as a church-sanctioned doctrine. So he worked very closely with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu in the struggle. And in 1982, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches came together, declared apartheid a heresy, and elected Alan Buzak as its president. That is the thing that broke the back of apartheid. Had it not happened, had church sanction continued, it would have been so hard to break that. So we said to Alan, we have a problem. Because our theologies say that wealth is a blessing from God. And we said, yeah, it is easy for us to say prosperity theology is terrible. We can condemn all those TV preachers. But that is not only the question. Prosperity theology is interwoven into our own liturgical traditions. Think about it. It is there in our liturgy, it's there in our hymnody, it's there in our preaching, it's there in our praying, most of all. God, give me a blessing. What happens when we say wealth is a blessing of God is that the corollary automatically happens, poor are cursed by God. So we said to Alan, we've got a theological problem that we have to deal with. And you are good at dealing with these things. Can you come and help us? And this is exactly what he did. We said, there was an idea called the common good. In fact, when the American experiment began, the colonies first came together. They called themselves commonwealths. Commonwealth. An idea that comes from the book of Acts, remember? They all held everything together in common, so that nobody had need among them. The commonwealth, wealth held in common, is an idea that is eroding very rapidly in favor of individual wealth, and it's going in that direction, and so we don't have the commonwealth that we used to have. That idea itself is breaking down. And so we wanted to ask this hard question of our theology. How do we do this? Those are the kinds of questions that are paramount for public theologians to be asking. Asking of our received theologies. How do we deal with these kinds of things? And so, if my first point is to ask questions, hard questions of our received theologies, my second point is to acknowledge that sometimes Christians don't have the answers. And sometimes the best answers come from our other religious partners. In March of 2009, just 6 months after the global financial crisis hit, the World Council of Churches advisory group called the Churches Commission on International Affairs met in Matanzas, Cuba. And their purpose was to think about what happened in this global financial crisis and how do we advise the churches on that. So they said three very important things for us to understand. First, they said, this is a matter of greed that happened, and that greed is a violence against us. Second thing they said is that Christians really don't have a robust reflection on greed. That in fact, Buddhists have a much better reflection. We ought to ask them. Imagine that, the most representative institution, Christian institution in the world, saying we don't have all the answers, we ought to ask the Buddhists. The third thing they said was that when we church executive kinds of people gather, let us acknowledge who's not at the table. We are all middle-class social elite people. People who are poor, who are mostly affected by this, people who have a robust discussion about these things in their communities are not at this table. So, let me speak to this second question about how we learn from other religious communities. First of all, it is useful to recall that there has always been in human history a prohibition against usury. This is a legal and religious prohibition, and most religious traditions had that. Right until about the middle of Jimmy Carter's term, we had that when, in this country, the Supreme Court removed those restrictions. And so what happened was that effectively removed all caps on interest rates. As a result, today it is not unusual if banks charge up to 35%, and it is also led to the surging of companies that do predatory lending that situate themselves at the edges of inner cities, such as payday loans. And so they prey upon people who are poor, sometimes charging them up to 400% on their next paycheck. This is not likely to happen in Sharia-compliant banking. You may have noticed that throughout the financial crisis, Islamic banks have been resilient. As you know, Muslims are not allowed to benefit from lending money. Earning interest, therefore, is haram. It is forbidden, whether you are an individual or a bank, and therefore interest is not paid on Islamic checking accounts or charged in Islamic mortgages. The prohibition dissuades Islamic banks from engaging in contracts considered excessively risky. And because they are not particularly motivated by producing high volume, they are known to be much more engaged with the customer and with the assets they are investing. Islamic banks, therefore, will not engage in the kinds of products that US financial institutes got us into trouble. Subprime mortgages and collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps and so on. This has made some of the US companies consider these as good practices. As a result of the rising demand for Islamic-friendly investment, multinational corporations are considering what the Quran has to say about their business practices. So in the financial sector, big banks such as Citigroup, HSBC, Deutsche Bank have products that are Sharia compliant, and estimated 300 Islamic financial institutions hold $500 billion in assets and issue Sharia-compliant loans, bonds, credit cards, and derivatives. In Islamic banking, financiers are required to share borrowers' risks. So depositors are treated more like shareholders, earning a portion of their profits. Theologically, the question boils down to the affirmation of common good, the ummah, the community of brothers and sisters in the Islamic world. You want to have everything in common. And the kind of business practices that led to that difficulty would violate the provisions of ummah. And therefore, they did not want to do that. They were very clear, because in history what had happened was that people would get into debt and would end up in slavery afterwards. And the prohibitions therefore are there in order to safeguard against that. Let's talk a little bit about Buddhism, since the CCIA particularly identified Buddhism about this question. Buddhism has a robust teaching, a sophisticated teaching about greed and its disastrous consequences, about the value of simplicity for the lay people and the renunciation and voluntary poverty for the monastic community. At the most basic level, Buddhism has 4 noble truths: that all existence is unsatisfactory, that the unsatisfactoriness derives from tanha, which is craving, greed. There is a way to get out of that unsatisfactoriness, this is nirvana, and there's an 8-fold path to achieving that. That's very 4 basic things that Buddhism has. But the reason or the cause for the suffering and the unsatisfactoriness of our existence is greed. And that's a part of, another way to think about it is as 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion that affect a human being's ability to be enlightened or achieve wisdom. The wisdom we are talking about here is nothing less than the ability to both comprehend and appropriate to your being that this very important truth that everything is impermanent. That's the wisdom we are seeking, that everything is impermanent. Even your soul, you have no soul. There's nothing that is permanent about you. Now, when you dig that, when you really understand that there is nothing permanent, not even you yourself, and there is no permanent soul that you have to worry about, life becomes a lot less complicated. And so you don't have to. And then so what happens is, when you deeply comprehend that, renouncing worldly possessions, embracing voluntary poverty, and living a dedicated life dedicated to the well-being of all becomes not what just an occasional odd ascetic does, it becomes normal practice. So following the encouragement of the CCIA, we brought together, World Council of Churches and Lutheran World Federation, brought together a dialogue between Christians and Buddhists on this question. And we entitled it, Christians and Buddhists Dealing with Structural Greed. Structural greed. And so, as you began, you had this really difficult situation where, because you had Christians who were more conservative and evangelically oriented, we had Buddhists who were more conservative, and suddenly you found that there was a connection between more conservative Buddhists and more conservative Christians. They all said, greed is not structural, it's all having to do with individuals. You take care of your sin, then you're all right. Or so... But then there were others of us who said, no, there is a structural element to that. Engaged Buddhists and ecumenical Christians came together on that. But the way that we agreed on this question came from a very important Buddhist concept called interbeing. Interbeing. It's a construct proposed by Thich Nhat Hanh, the famed engaged Buddhist proponent and teacher. And he paints this picture for us. And I want to quote to you a little piece. In one sheet of paper, we see everything. The cloud, the forest, the logger, perhaps the bees. I am, therefore you are. You are, therefore I am. We inter are. I know that in our previous lives we were trees. And even in this life, we continue to be trees. Without trees, we cannot have people. Therefore, trees and people inter-are. We are trees and air, bushes and clouds. If trees cannot survive, humankind is not going to survive either. If we were to say, I am, therefore you are therefore I am, suggests that there is no autonomous, independent, absolute, sovereign subject. The Buddhist subject is relational, interdependent, socially constituted, and vulnerable. Our mutual vulnerability, in the sense that we are susceptible to one another, is what makes us human. Since we inter-are, your loss would greatly impact my very being, as if a part of me was missing as well. Engaged Buddhists thus seek to foster conditions that would help guarantee that all sentient beings have livable lives. This implies that violent structures have to be dismantled. And so Sulak Sivaraksa, the Thai Buddhist leader of engaged Buddhism, says, being a good Buddhist involves rupturing the unjust status quo and stirring trouble. So yes, we gather with colleagues from other religious traditions, and we sit at nice conference rooms, we have good meals, and we read theological papers, and we learn from each other. It's very good. I like to go for these things. But we rarely ask the question, who is at the table? And that's my third point. And who is not at the table? So the CCIA, in his incisive critique, made this important observation that we must listen to the voices, not only voices of those who are poor, since they said, we are all people who are in positions of leadership, we are not all well placed to hear the voices of the oppressed, indigenous people, women, the disabled, of refugees, and displaced people, of the poor who are most silenced among us. I like these kinds of conversations, but here is what happened when I read an essay that was written by Harvey Cox. You all know Harvey Cox, the professor from Harvard. Back in 1980s, Harvey wrote this essay about theology and how it is done, or what is it, how it is done, and who does it. And he said this, that there is an elitism in theological thinking. He said the elitism is understandable given the minimal conditions for doing theology include the ability to read and write, familiarity with the received tradition and concepts and categories, sufficient leisure to reflect on those, and the power to get one's ideas published or otherwise heard. So he asks, are theologians prepared to take the next step beyond the critical self-awareness we now have, for example, of how the rhetorical conventions and cultural symbols of any period shape even its most original theology? Let me say that one more time. How the rhetorical convention and cultural symbols of any period shape even its most original theology, to a recognition of how the pervasive ideology of the dominant class influences the theology it produces. So I don't know how to unpack that except by going to one of my mentors to help you with that. I'm from Sri Lanka, as you heard. One of my mentors is Father Aloysius Piris. He's a Jesuit, an older man now, but he is one of those deeply honored scholars of Buddhism and Christianity. He said in his Asian Theology of Liberation, an authentic Sri Lankan theology must undergo a double baptism, the Jordan of its religious diversity and the cross of its grinding poverty. These two axes, religious diversity and poverty, are basic facts of Sri Lankan context, he says, and we might add theology is more than an academic exercise done in religious seminars organized and financed by Western agencies, he said, by people who do not have their feet on the ground. It is not an abstract concern, he said. Interreligious dialogue is not an abstract concern, but a daily existential experience, never merely an intellectual exercise. It's a moral commitment. Pires' analysis suggests that if we want to engage in dialogue, we need to incarnate ourselves in the context. It requires a double baptism of immersion in the world of religions and the context of grinding poverty. Both those. The question, however, is a bit more complex. There's plenty of dialogue that is going on in poor communities around the world, even here, right here, in this city. Poor Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and those of other religions often live in the same communities. They share each other's concerns and needs and reflect with each other about their fortunes and misfortunes and the ultimate meanings of life and day-to-day events. The difficulty for us middle-class theologians is that we have no access to that conversation. Many difficulties around those of communication and building trust becomes enormous barriers when we try to come from outside and listen to their dialogue. So, is there any hope for interreligious dialogue? According to Pires, there is no alternative but to engage in voluntary poverty. Which, for religious people, he says, is really a positive value. We must struggle against forced poverty, but voluntary poverty is a spiritual calling we must embrace. Some of the greatest saints and revered gurus in our religious traditions were people who renounced worldly comforts and pleasures. Some entered the monastic life. Others, like Gandhi, became engaged in issues of social justice. Now you're getting really worried, I know. Because all this time you thought theology was done in the library, in the comfort of the library. But yes, this is a problem. Let's just acknowledge that this is a problem. For most of us whose perceptions are colored by the dominant economic ethos, where the desire is to reach higher in the economic ladder, where that's a positive value, voluntary poverty does not make sense. Pires asserts that it is simply not possible for people with a middle-class mindset to really understand and appreciate those who are poor. Those who engage in the discipline of theology and of interreligious dialogue must therefore, he says, undergo a conversion and undertake the baptism of voluntary poverty themselves. This is what we try to do at SCUPE. We put our students out into the community with understanding that you're really not getting the story. You're only messing with the edges. Until and unless you live in the community, you're not going to get the story. Because you have to earn people's trust. You have to be a part of them in order to understand what is going on so that you can look at the world from the perspective of the margins. But it is where we send them. In the margins, our students have seen dialogue burst into argument, controversy, and creativity. There, it never stays mere dialogue, but moves quickly into action. In the margins, people are conscientized, they strategize, they organize, they move to light a fire under their religious and political leaders. When religious leaders do not have the courage to do the right thing, it is the organized people who, from the grassroots, that are able to hold their religious leaders and their political leaders accountable, so that rather than compromise on ethical principles, they are able to courageously advance the cause of justice such that it leads to peace. So one final point. Many, perhaps most Christians have a great deal of difficulty engaging in this way, particularly in the questions of interreligious dialogue. I think because we have a missional mindset. Most of us have been told from our childhood that we know the truth and others don't. Therefore, there's really nothing we can learn from those others. There's a lot we can teach to others. We have a story to tell the nations, sang my Baptist church when I was a kid. We never really said we have a story to hear from the nations. Not that there is something we must learn, therefore we must go. Not that there is something we must learn, and therefore we must go and incarnate ourselves in the margins, so that they might do us the favor of honoring us and honor us by telling us their story. It is with this mindset that the colonial mission movement for 500 years went out to the rest of the world. And those who still have that mindset find it very difficult to engage in this kind of dialogue. But a very interesting thing happened at the World Council of Churches Assembly, 10th General Assembly in Busan, South Korea in November of 2013. It adopted from the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism a new statement on mission. It is called Together Towards Life. You should Google that and read it. Together Towards Life. Here is the crux of that statement. It says, mission is from the margins. We used to think it goes from the center to the margins. No, it says mission is from the margins to the privileged center. Think about the implications of that. It turns the entire mission paradigm upside down. And so we, all of us, theologians, religious leaders, pastors, we have to ask some very different questions about what it means. It says to us powerfully that those who are hungry today have something important to teach us about economic justice. It's about life and its meaning, and about the importance of sharing and community. Those who are working 2 or 3 jobs at minimum wage and have kids to take care of at home, but also have something to teach us about economic justice, about faith. These are people who come home after 3 jobs and come sit down and pray with their children in the evening. They have something to teach us about faith. Those who are struggling in places where climate change has wrought havoc, they have something to teach us about life's fragility and resilience. Those who are Buddhists and Hindus and Jews and Muslims have something to teach us, not only about greed, but about God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And when we get that, we will discover that our questions are different, our answers are different, and more than anything else, our attitude towards life and its meaning will be different, our lifestyle will be different. What happened in 2008, what's happening in cities around our nation in terms of religious extremism and the theological justifications for injustice and violence must cause us to stop and ask, what's wrong with our theology? We must ask, how can we learn from our colleagues from other religious traditions about the wisdom they have to offer? How can we work together? We must ask how we can engage with those who are in the margins in our community. So I hope I have at least rekindled some hope in you that religious communities have theological or philosophical basis for such engagement, and that the capacity to be organized to act on those questions. But in order for that to be true, we, you and I, in this place, must allow ourselves that those in the margins will teach us, will missionize us, will indeed convert us. Thank you for your attention.